Hi, my name is Chris Bailey, and in this CG Cookie tutorial, we're going to be making Pong using Blender. Let's jump into it. Go check out our Fundamentals of Animation in Blender course on cgcookie.com, or if annual membership isn't your thing, you can find the course as a standalone product on the Blender market. Links are in the description below. So this tutorial is really meant for somebody who's never really used Blender before. This is gonna be our very first scene. We're gonna put something together that's super simple, super straightforward, and we can use it to then go on and do a basic animation tutorial, which is gonna be part 2 of these two-part series. First one, we're gonna make the Pong. Second one, we're gonna make the Pong move. Here we go. So what we're gonna do first is take a look at the original OG Pong. Here it is. This is what it looked like back in the day, the birth of video games. I mean, things have come a little ways, not very far. It'd be a little hard to put microtransactions into this. So resident animation genius Wayne Dixon on CG Cookie posted up this when I was asking about ideas for how to do a basic animation tutorial. And I thought this was a really good setup to work with. It looks really nice and chunky. We can make this stuff pretty easily in Blender. So this is what we're going to be aiming for. Let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually get my perspective right. So I want to set my camera up so it's looking at this scene in the way that I want it to, which is from the top down. So what I'm going to do is select my camera in my viewport just by clicking on it with my left mouse button. And then I'm going to make sure I'm over here on my orange Object Properties tab. Now these tabs change based on what you've got selected. So you can see if I select the cube, it's going to give me the object properties for the cube. So the location and the rotation and the scale, along with any specific modifiers or particle systems or materials that are assigned to this cube. So when I click the camera, it's going to change. We're going to get some different tabs here based on the objects that you have picked. So keep that in mind. We can see the position and the rotation of this camera is set to its position here, which is kind of weird. It's off in 3D space somewhere. And 3D space is always represented by X, Y, and Z. So the 3 coordinates. So you see this giant grid that we've got. This green line is the Y coordinate, and the X line is the red line is the X coordinate, and up and down is the Z coordinate. You can see that referenced here in this little reference widget that's showing us kind of, keeps us oriented. Which direction are we facing? So these values represent actual positions in 3D space for where this camera sits on all of those different planes. Now, what we're going to do is let's take the rotation, and I'll just set the X, Y, and Z rotation to 0. And then I'm going to rotate around by using my middle mouse button and holding down Shift and clicking my middle mouse button to move around, pan my viewport, clicking and holding middle mouse button without Shift to orbit. That's kind of how you move around. Now, what we're going to do is go ahead and take this and we're going to position it kind of right over our cube. So I'm going to take the Z value and just drag it up by clicking and dragging to raise the camera up. And I want it to be positioned right over this cube. So we could actually give this camera the same X and Y coordinates as the cube. So let's have a look at the cube. It's at 0, 0, 0. So we don't want to change the Z because we want to keep that way up high. But we can make this one 0. And that will put it on the same value for the X, and then that one on the Y. And now, as you can see, it's directly over the cube. Let's jump into the camera now and see how that looks. So I'm going to hit 0 on my number keypad. And now we can see the scene. Now let's set our camera up so it's a little easier to view just what is going to render. Because remember, we're only going to be able to, when we hit render, it's only going to render what the camera sees. So I'm going to click on the camera tab with the camera selected. And I'm going to come over here to viewport display and drop this tab open. And where it says passport 2 and in 0.5, I'm going to turn this up. All this doesn't change or render or anything. It's just a quality of life feature where you can basically dim or make opaque the region that's outside of the view of your camera. Just a bit easier to see if I turn that all the way up to 1. I like that. That's how I like to work. Now, while looking through our camera, I could come to my object properties again, and I can drag the Z to raise the camera up. You can see our perspective changes as well, so we can get a different view. So I'm going to come up a little bit further. I'm going to come all the way up to 50. Okay, now that I'm at 50, let's start modeling out our paddles to begin with. So I'll grab this cube and we'll start with the cube. Now I want to move the cube into a place where it's right over here on the side, and then I'm going to squash it down so it's really narrow. So what I want to do is use the G key to do that command. Now there's a lot of ways to move things around. G stands for grab. So if I hit G, I can move my mouse, and you can see it stays locked to my mouse until I click. And now it's going to stop being locked to my mouse, and now it's got a new position. And you can see under the Object Properties tab, it's changed these numbers. So it's moved it on the X to this point and the Y to this point. So I could do these manually, or I can move them around with the G key. Now you don't have to have your mouse over the object. All it has to be is selected. So if I select my light and move my mouse over here and hit G, you can see it locks with my mouse, and when I click, it's going to drop it. Now, another good thing to note is if you're in this mode, but you didn't want to be, you can hit escape and it'll pop back to where it originally was. Naturally, you can undo as well. All right, so let's find a spot for this that we want. Now, I want to be moving this around, but I want to keep it, flat on the ground. I don't want to like grab this and accidentally have it start moving around. It's not at the moment, which is fine. But if you want to like just move on one of those axes, what you can do is you can hit G to grab, and then you can pick whichever one you want by hitting the X, Y, or Z key. So if I hit X, now it's going to track with my mouse, but only on the X plane. If I hit Y, it's going to only track on the Y plane. If I hit Z, it's only going to move up and down. So that's a really great way to easily get things to move to where you want them to go. One other way of doing it is to come over here to the side window. And if you don't see this, if you hit the T key, it will make it appear or disappear. Also, every window in Blender has got this little tiny arrow. If you click it, it'll make it appear as well. So you can see there's one over here. If I click that, N is the hotkey to make this one appear and disappear. But if you forget the hotkeys, you can always just click that, or you can hide it by dragging it over until it disappears. Now, if I grab this here, this gives me some handles, and I can click and move these handles now in the same way we were using the G key. So this is another great way just to move things around. It's really just up to you and what you prefer to use. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to G, X, and move him off to the side. Now, what I want to do is elongate him. So I can do this a couple of different ways. I could use the S key. Now, S stands for scale. And you can see we've got the scale values are all set to 1. But watch these values. As I hit S and I drag my mouse, these are going to get bigger and it's going to change its size. But I don't want to scale it overall. I just want to like scale it on the Y because I want to stretch it out on the up and down. So if I hit, I still have S activated. I haven't clicked yet. Now, if I hit Y, you can see it's going to scale just on the Y. So I can scale this guy up. And then I can hit S and X and scale it in this way. Okay, so my paddle's probably a little bit too big, so I'm gonna hit S one more time and just scale it down a little bit so that it looks a little bit better. If you wanna try and match my numbers, you can see them here. In fact, I might just make them a bit cleaner. I'll make X 0.2, I'll make Y 2.5, and I'll make Z 0.5. Okay, so now we need another paddle that's just like this one. So we're gonna duplicate this object. So I'm going to grab it and I'm going to use the hotkey Shift D, and Shift D duplicates. You can see when I hit Shift D now it's locked to my mouse, just like as if I hit grab with G or anything like that. Now if I hit X, it'll do the same thing. It sort of transitions when you duplicate an object, it immediately switches into grab mode. So I can move it around. So it'd be exactly the same as if I just hit G, and now we could do that as well. So I'm gonna move him right over, and I can use the grid to kind of space things out. So I can see I've got 1, 2, 3 grid squares just before this one. So I could do the same thing and kind of get this one positioned in a very similar spot. Another way though, if I wanted it exact, is I could actually look at where's the X position of this guy. So this guy is at this number right here. I could copy this number. So I could hit Control C or Apple C, and I could copy that. And now I could come over here and I can paste that number, but instead of negative, come right here, I can get rid of the negative symbol. And now it's going to be exactly the same distance from this center point here, but on the other direction. So that's a cool way that you can think about these numbers to get things positioned. Now, if you can't remember the hotkey to duplicate, you can always do it. You would think you'd find it up here in the edit menu, but that's not actually where it lives. A lot of pretty much all the commands actually live right here. In this section, we've got the object drop down. You can see all these different things we can do to the object that we have selected. And you can see right here, duplicate objects, Shift D. Another great way to find something if you can't remember the hotkey is to use the F3 key. So if you type F3, you get this nice search box and you can type in anything. So I can type in duplicate and it will automatically narrow it down to all the different commands that have this phrase in it. So it's a really great way to search and find things that you can't quite remember how to do. Or if you want to do something, you're not sure there's a command for it, you hit F3, you can type in, it'll get you right to where you need to go. So it's really useful. All right, so let's go ahead and create a cube in our scene to have to make our little Pong ball. So I'm going to go Shift A to bring up the create menu, and I'm going to go mesh and go to cube. I could also get that by just coming up here to add mesh cube. It's going to do exactly the same thing. You can see we have a new cube. And in our hierarchy here, this is the outliner, which is showing us all the things in our scene. You can see it's added a new cube. It's automatically named it. Every object in Blender needs to have a unique name. So Blender will automatically add this numbering system to something if it's got the same name, which you can see cube has the same name 3 times. So let's hit S to scale, and let's just drag down till it's a little bit smaller. Something like this maybe. And we could come over here and we could enter in a value for each of these if we like, say 0.3, for example. We could just type in 0.3 3 for each of these. Another great way to do this, though, it's a lot quicker, is if you click and drag down, now you can enter one number and it will fill it into all 3. So that's a handy little tip you can use for any of these different inputs. All right, so now that we've got some objects, let's go ahead and name some things so we don't get too confused. I'm going to come over to my outliner and I'll select things. You can see when I select things in the outliner, it selects them in the viewport as well. So you can always see what object is what. So I'm going to take the first cube and I will call this paddle, and I'll select my other cube and I'll name this paddle as well. You can see Blender automatically adds 0.001 to the end of it so that it knows this is a new object, right? So it's giving it a fresh name. Now for the cube, we'll call our ball. And this is all contained within something called a collection. A collection is like a folder that you can use to organize your scene. It doesn't have any physical representation in the scene. It's just something that exists in the outliner, but it's really useful. So we could create a new collection, for example, by clicking up here, this little new collection button. And if we click on the scene collection, it'll put it within this hierarchy. If we click it while it's in here, it'll put it within this collection. If I want to put it in my scene collection, I'll do that, automatically names it collection 2. We could call this our mesh, for example. And then I can just shift click these guys and drag them into the mesh. And I can grab my ball and drag it in here. And now my scene's just a little more organized in my outliner. I've got my mesh objects and I've got my camera and lights in another collection. What's also useful is you can universally turn these guys on and off, which is really nice. Okay, so next we're going to create the boundaries of our Pong set. So I'm going to use a cube again to do that. Now, I want it to be the same height as these guys right here. If I jump out of my camera just by clicking and holding down the middle mouse button to orbit my view, it's going to automatically kick me out of my camera. And I can go back to my 3D view and have a look at things. Now, I like the idea of all these things having kind of the same height. I think that kind of feels like it might be, I don't know, look nice with the perspective. So I'm going to take one of these guys here and I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. And I don't really want to move it just yet with my mouse pointer. So I'm just going to hit Escape and that will snap it right back to its initial position. Now don't get confused because it's in the same position and it's the same size as the other paddle. You can easily think that you only have 2 paddles in the scene, but just keep an eye on your outliner to know how many objects you actually have and what they're called. So I'm going to rotate this guy 90 degrees. Now I want to move him so that he's lined up along here at the top. So to rotate 90 degrees, first thing you want to think about is, well, what axis do I want to use to rotate? So in this case, I don't want to rotate him on the X or the Y. I need to rotate it sort of from the top down. So I need to rotate on the Z. So what I can do with that is I can hit R. Now R is the hotkey for rotation. So I'm going to hit R to rotate, and then I can enter in a value for degrees of how much I want to rotate it. So I want to rotate 90 degrees, but I just want to do it on the Z. So the next thing I'm going to do is hit Z on my keyboard, or Z, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm going to hit now 90. I'm going to type in 90, and you can see it automatically rotates it exactly 90 degrees. And I know it's been rotated exactly 90 degrees because over here in my object properties, you can see it says 90. Now, of course, I could have just typed it in here. It would have done the same thing. So there's just lots of ways to do stuff in Blender. Now I'm going to jump back into my camera by hitting 0 on my number keypad, and I'll drag up on my handle here, and then I'm going to position it right in the middle. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, and instead of like doing it by eye with G and X and kind of lining it up, I want to actually come over here to my X location and click on it and just type 0. Okay, so now I want to scale this guy out so that he's beyond the borders of my view. So I just want to create this boundary line at the top and the bottom of my screen. Now I could hit S and X to scale on the X and do it that way. I can do another thing, which is called edit mode. I can enter edit mode and change the geometry within edit mode. Now this is a really important concept in Blender. It's very important to understand you have different modes. And you can see the mode you're in right up here in this little drop down. And we've been in object mode this whole time. But if I was to switch to edit mode, you can see I've got a couple others as well, but edit mode would be the main one you always go to. We're now able to edit the geometry of the object. Now the quickest way to swap between edit and object mode is to use the tab key. So with this cube selected, I'm going to hit tab to enter edit mode. And within edit mode, it allows us to actually change the position of individual parts of this mesh. So if I click on a vertex, for example, and hit G, I can move it and change the shape of this cube entirely. So now it's something totally different, and then hit tab to leave edit mode. And now it's going to be permanently changed. When you're in edit mode, you've got 3 different phases. You've got the vertex mode, you've got edge mode, and you've got face mode. And you can switch between them here. And basically just allows you to select different components of this object. So I can select just edges now if I'm in edge mode, or I go to face mode, I can't select edges anymore, but I can select faces. So what I can do is just select this face, and I can either use my widget or I can hit G and X and drag it out and grab this face, and G and X and grab it out. So see, it's exactly the same result. It's just a different way of doing it. But what's interesting about that compared to what we're normally doing is that you can see the scale hasn't changed. So we haven't actually changed the scale of this object. We've actually just changed what it is fundamentally. So Blender kind of works in these stages. You've got the sort of foundational layer, which is edit mode, and that's where you can change the mesh of an object. And then in object mode, that's where you place the object in the space or change its scale on a global level overall. So those are the different tiers. Again, for this, you really just need to scale. It's all you need to do. I just wanted to show you edit mode so you can get a sense of it and know that it's there. All right, so now what I'm gonna do is take this one, and again, I'm gonna Shift D to duplicate and bring it down. But before we do that, let's go ahead and rename it so we don't get confused. I'm gonna call this wall. And then I'm gonna Shift D to duplicate, and then I'm gonna grab Y, and I'm gonna do the same thing I did before where I'm gonna just create the negative position. So I just click this Y value, pop over here and hit the minus key, and that'll put it right here at the same distance from the center as this one. So great, we've got our two boundary lines for our game of Pong. It's looking really nice. Now, the last thing I want to do is what we've got in this reference. We've got this really nice sort of dashed boundary in the center that kind of shows, okay, this is the middle part of the field. So what we're going to do is create something like that. So I'm going to take my little ball and I'm going to Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to hit G and Y, and I'll bring it right down. I'll bring it right down about here. Now I want to have a bunch of little cubes running from here up to here. Now I could just Shift D to duplicate and move this the same distance a bunch of times, but that might take a little while, and there's much faster ways of doing it. One of the ways is to use something called a modifier. If we have this little guy selected, we can come over to our tabs on the side here, and I can select this wrench tab. This gives me the modifiers that I can apply to this little cube. If I click this drop down menu, you see we have all these different types of modifiers. So these things do all kinds of crazy things. It's really fun to experiment with. So I'd encourage you to give them all a try. What I want to use is an array modifier. And now you can see he's actually extended out a little bit. And I'll get this factor here, and I can use this to move it out and increase the number of cubes that I've got. So I'm going to make factor X to be 0, and because I just want him to move on the Y. So I'm going to click here, and if I type a 1 here, that's going to move him up. And if I just drag this up a little bit, it'll start to space them out. So I can decide how much of a gap I want between each one, and then I can increase my count. There we go. So I've got this nice border. Now I think I want this border to exist below the cube so the cube doesn't intersect it as it flies. So if I just leave my camera's view a little bit, I can hit G and Z just to drop these guys down here. So it's just sitting below. Now if I look through, I'll be able to see it a little bit separately. So now I've got my border, and I've got my Pong, and I've got my paddles and my boundaries. Let's go ahead and set up some rendering. So what I want to do is I'm going to switch over. We're going to do all this in Eevee. So if I click on the render properties, you can see our render engine is set to Eevee. Now bear in mind, like I said before, when you select these guys, you're going to get different settings in the tabs, but one group of settings always stays the same, and that's everything above this orange box. So if I select my camera, you can see I get a bunch of different things, but this orange box and up kind of stays separate. This tab always corresponds to information about the collection that this object is contained in. And then these tabs always correspond to your entire scene. So this is what is the world of your scene. What's the entire background shader look like? This is different scene units. This is different view layers, which is a compositing thing. And then we have this little printer icon, which is where we can set up the different render settings. And right here as well, the camera icon, which is the actual render settings. This is the output settings. These are the render settings. So those don't change based on object. They're kind of universal for your whole scene, but you access them here as well. Okay, so we're on Eevee. Eevee is Blender's real-time rendering engine, which is really great. It renders things basically like a computer game does. There's a lot of great tricks you can do with Eevee. But what's cool about it is it lets us see what the render is going to look like in the viewport while we're working. Now, I'm going to actually change my viewport to rendered view. So I'm going to come over here and hit this button right up here. These are the different view modes. We've got wireframe, which shows us the wires that make up our mesh. Viewport shading, the flat shading, which is what we've been working at here. We've got material shading, which shows us just the materials themselves. And then we have the final rendered image. So you can see here, if I click my light and I can grab my light, you can see it actually lights the scene in a really cool way there. But I'm going to get rid of this light because we're going to go for just the straight traditional Pong look. So I'm going to hit X to delete that light there. Or you can also just hit the delete key. That works too. And first thing I want to do is hide all of my controllers. So I'm going to click up this Show Overlays button. If I click this, it's going to get rid of all the overlays. And if I click this, it'll get rid of all the widgets. So now I'm looking at a really clean display of what my final render could look like. Now I want to select some things. So I'm going to go ahead and grab one of my paddles. And you can see it's no longer highlighted in the viewport. That's because we've got this widget Show Overlays turned off. So if you ever get lost and you want to figure out what you're looking at, you can just turn this back on. Now we're going to go down to the bottom to the Materials tab. You can see we already have a default material applied to it. And this is all fine. I don't really want to touch any of these things, but I'm going to come down to this value here called emission. And I'm going to click where it's black and I'm going to make it white. Emission is a special type of shader that emits light into the scene. So I'm going to use this emission, and if I turn up my strength, I can get them to glow even brighter. Now you can see that these walls and the paddles all lit up together. It's because they all have the same material on them, and that's because we were duplicating with Shift-D. So it duplicated the material as well, kept the same material on those objects. So if I come over here, we go back up to the top, I could change this material. We can call this our white glow material. And let's take the boundary, and we don't have a material on the boundary. So if we come over to the Material tab, we can click this drop down. You can see white glow is listed here. So we can actually just pick this one if we wanted it to have the same material. Or what we could do is we create a new material. So I can actually hit X to get rid of it and click New, and now we can build a new material. We can call this Boundary. And let's say with the boundary, instead of white, we go for more of like a gray. So it's a bit dimmer. Now let's grab the ball and let's give the ball maybe a brighter color than the paddles themselves. So I'm going to select the ball and then I'll click New and I'll call this Ball. And I'll come down here and I will set my emission to pure white. And then I'm going to drag my strength up a little bit. I'll set my strength to 2 for the ball. But we're not going to see anything change yet. And let's come back over here to our render settings. What I want to do next is tick this box here called Bloom. What Bloom does is it takes everything that's emitting light, and if it's emitting light beyond a value of 1, it starts to give it a bit of a halo or glow effect. It's a really cool effect in Eevee. So if I click this, you can see our little guy starts to glow a little bit. All right, let's go ahead and take our ball and let's move it away from the center so we can see it a bit clearer. I'm going to hit G and X, and I'll just bring it over here. I'm also going to rename ball.001. This is actually our boundary object. You can see here, I'm going to rename this boundary. Now, if I take one of my paddles and I go to the Material tab to white glow or white glow material, come back down to emission strength, see as I turn it up, they're going to glow more and more. So you can set that however you like. Now, last thing is if you want the background to be black, you need to go to the World tab. Now, the world is always going to determine what does your world look like? And by world, I mean, think of a sphere that surrounds your entire scene and has something on it. So it can be a photograph if you wanted it to look like, say a forest. You could have different types of colors. You could even create a complex shader to put on your world, and it's going to appear around all of your objects. Right now it's set to just a default gray. So if you click on the color, you can see it's set here to a gray color. You can just grab this and drag it down to black. And now we're going to get a nice black scene. Okay, now one last thing we're going to do to really make this thing pop and look nice is we're going to go Shift A, and we're going to create a plane. I'm going to turn on my widgets and stuff so we can see them again. I'm going to scale this plane up so that it's bigger than my camera's view. And then what I want to do is I'm going to pop out of my camera view by clicking and holding the mouse button. I'm going to hit G and Z, and I'm going to drag it down so that it's below my boundary. And then I'm going to come over to the Material tab with the plane still selected. I'm going to click New to create a new material. I'll call this Ground. Then we're going to come right down here to this value called Roughness. And I'm going to drag it right down. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to show it to you so you can see the effect happening in the viewport. I'm going to come up here to my Render tab, and we're going to turn on one more thing. Right here, Screen Space Reflections. Turn that on. And now I go back to the Material tab, and we take the Roughness. And as I drag this down, it's going to turn more and more into a mirror-like surface. I'm going to just find a nice value, maybe have it blurred a little bit, something like this. And I'll jump back into my camera, and you can see we get this really cool reflective floor now. Now, if you want to have a number system, so you've got some scoring going on in your game, you can always go Shift A and add a text object. Let's give it the glow material. And then if you hit Tab to go into edit mode, that's how you can change what text says. So I can come here and say, all right, I want to have a 1 or a 2, maybe if they've scored 2 points. I'm going to hit 0 to start with 0. I'll hit Tab to leave edit mode, and I'll just grab it and put it over here. Might scale it up a little bit. Now, one thing you can't do is animate what this text says. So we actually need to create a different object for the different numbers. So if I Shift D to duplicate this and hide the first one, I can select the second one, hit Tab, go back and type a 1. That way I've got my 0, I've got my 1, and then let's maybe do a 2 as well. So Shift D to duplicate, and I'll hide the other one so it's not in the way. Tab, type 2, and now I've got a 1, 2, and a 0. And then I can take each of these and I'll name them. So I'll name this one 0, I name this one 1, and I'll name this one 2. And when it comes to animating, we'll just animate the visibility of these guys when a point is scored. So I'm going to click my scene collection, click New Collection, double click on it, and type numbers. And I will Shift select these guys and drag them into the collection, just like that. There we go. Now I am going to also select each of them and Shift D to duplicate. And I will grab them and move them right over here so they're roughly in the same spot on the other side. So I'm going to change these names a little bit. I'm going to make this 0L to stand for the left side. And instead of 0.001, I'll do 0R. And I'll just use that naming convention. So I've gone on to Google Fonts, and I've just looked through the different fonts that are available. And I found this cool one here called Obatron. And I've downloaded it. You can see it's got a really nice 0 and the numbers look really boxy and stuff. I think it'll fit our style pretty well. So this is a great free open source way of doing fonts. Just use Google Fonts. So I'll just download that. You can download it as well. You'll find that included in the project file that we'll have up on CG Cookies. You can download the whole thing along with the license for this font. So I'm going to use that font. So I'm going to navigate over to the font here, and I'll just pick the folder and I'll type in. So type in Orbitron, there it is, select that, open the font, and now I've got my Orbitron font, and I can just set that for each of these. And there you have it, we've got our Pong scene ready to go for animation. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for the animation tutorial where we're gonna take a look at how to animate your first scene in Pong using Blender. If you wanna find out when we drop new tutorials, you can ring the notification bell. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to check out cgcookie.com as well. We've got a ton of great stuff over there for you. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Until then, see you later. Bye.